This is another Behind the Veil segment, a continuing series here at Our Lady of Mercy Church. If you recall, one of our previous Behind the Veil segments talked about the Ark of the Covenant and our tabernacle and made an analogy between the two. The original Ark of the Covenant contained three things. I want to go over them once again for you because they're very important when it comes to this particular Behind the Veil, which is entitled The Table of the Lord, or Our Altar. The Ark of the Covenant contained the staff of the high priest Aaron. It also contained the tablets of the law, the Ten Commandments, and it contained manna from heaven, or the food of life. So how do we get from the Ark of the Covenant to the table of the Lord here at Lady of Mercy to our fabulous altar? It goes like this. The Lord created several covenants, a covenant being an agreement. One covenant was with Adam. That one didn't go so well. The second one was with Noah. The next covenant was with Abraham. The next covenant was with Moses. Well, the Lord decided that we needed to do something different. So Jesus appeared on the scene. Jesus became the new way, the new Adam, the new chief priest, the bread from heaven. He brought us the new law, and with all of that, he brought us the new covenant, the new agreement. So we move from Holy Week into the weeks following, leading up to Pentecost. And I thought it was appropriate that we talk about the table of the Lord. So when Jesus and his apostles met for the Passover meal, which ultimately referred to as the Last Supper, Jesus decided that he was going to show us this new way. Animal sacrifices had been the norm previously, but Jesus chose common bread and wine and decided that he would show us that since he was now the sacrifice, that we could commemorate that sacrifice with common bread and wine. And he showed the apostles how to do that. And all of you remember exactly his words when he said, "This is my body, which will be given up for you. Eat this and do it in memory of me." And also we remember that when he said, "This is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant. Drink of it and do this in memory of me." Jesus was foretelling to his apostles that his passion was on the horizon, and the horizon was closing in and was very nearby. In the days of Jesus, altars were what we called altar stones. They were movable. They were very small stones that the early Christians carried around with them. You see, in those days, for fear of being persecuted by the Romans, the Christians went into the catacombs where the martyrs and others were buried. And they were buried in these stone vaults. And so they brought their altar stone, which had crosses cut in all of the corners, and they placed it in the catacombs. They also, since the catacombs were dark and dingy, they also brought with them candles to light the way. So in the catacombs, that's where they said Mass. That's where the apostles moved around and said Masses in homes and houses and any other place that they could for fear of the Romans. So as altars evolved over the years, they later became made out of wood, and we started seeing wooden altars. Now, during the Last Supper, we so often see depictions of the Last Supper where Jesus and his apostles are sitting at a very large rectangular table. That's probably not the way it was. They were sitting on cushions on the floor with a very low table. We also remember some movies where they talk about the Holy Grail and they show a chalice that's tremendously covered with ornaments and precious stones and stuff. More than likely, the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper was very common looking and was made out of stone. These were the types of implements used in those days. So we move from an altar stone to wooden altars that were used in the early days. And then later, in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, we started moving to stone altars as larger churches became constructed. And those stone altars were placed over the graves of some of our martyrs. So some of the early basilicas in Europe had stone altars over the graves of martyrs, such as St. Peter's does today. So when we start talking about our table of the Lord here, it was consecrated in 1974 when this church was constructed, and a bishop would have done that consecration. Our altar is very impressive, contemporary in style, but on the other hand, somewhat simple. It's made out of seashell marble, and the children in the school, when we bring them in here to talk to them about some of these things, they love to put their fingers in the seashell fossils because it is literally covered with them. So our altar is adorned by a number of things. And these things that I'm going to mention to you are always in place on the altar. The first one would be our altar cloth here, this outer covering. Our altar cloth covers the altar, and this originally came from the days of Jesus when we started using wooden altars, a little after the days of Jesus, when we started using wooden altars. And they put an altar cloth on the wooden altar to protect it from stains or damage. This tradition has just been passed down over the years. So we have an altar cloth here, and it actually sort of stands for reverence. So we're reverencing the altar by having this covering on it. The other thing that I want to mention here is that our altar, just like the original altar stones, has a cut cross in each corner. And it also has some sepulchres or sepulchres in our altar. We have one here under the altar cloth, and we have one here under the altar cloth. These sepulchres, which means tomb, are boxes that are encased in our marble altar. These boxes contain the relics of some martyrs and saints that have gone before us. In the 8th century, the Council of Nicaea discussed the placing of relics in altars, and that tradition has been passed down through the canons all these years. So the church likes for parishes to have relics in their altars. Our particular altar is very unusual. We have 6 relics, not just 1 or 2, 6. We have 3 in this sepulcher, which is on the tabernacle side, and we have 3 in this sepulcher, which faces the congregation. The 3 in this sepulcher here are amazingly St. Andrew the Apostle. I want to pay particular attention to that because in the 1960s, the Vatican transferred all of the relics, the known relics of St. Andrew the Apostle, to the Eastern Orthodox Church because that's where he preached and where he died. Our pastor who had this church built was Monsignor Andrew Fry, and I suspect that he had a lot to do with getting a relic of St. Andrew the Apostle. That's a very unusual relic to have. We also have St. Maria Goretti in there, and St. Henri is in there. In this sepulcher, we have St. John Vianney, St. Francis Cabrini, and St. Pope Pius X. Very unusual to have sepulchres on both sides. My initial thought when I'm asked about this is that I would have suspected that it was done this way because the initial intention is that for daily masses, the priest would stand on this side and say Mass in the direction of Mary's chapel. And then for weekend masses and special masses, the priest would stand here directed towards the main congregation or the main nave of the church. Now, the interesting thing about having these relics here is that, and I don't think many people particularly notice this, but when the clergy come to the altar at the beginning of Mass, and they do the same thing at the end of Mass, the first thing they do is they come up in the sanctuary and genuflect, reverencing the tabernacle. Then they move around to this side of the altar, and they bend at the waist, and they kiss the altar. They are acknowledging and reverencing the sacrifices of those that have gone before, Jesus, the martyrs and saints that have gone before us. So that is the purpose of that kissing of the altar before and after each Mass. Our altar also has on it 2 candles. These candles are required by the church in regulation. The church says that we need at least 2 candles by the altar during all services. We can have more than that, and at different times of the year we vary that. During Advent we have these 2 candles. During Lent we have these 2 candles. And most of the other times of the year we have 4 candles on pedestals standing 2 on either side of the altar. These candles are most unusual. They're very ornate. They're 3-sided. We have Jesus on one side, Mary on another, and the Sacred Heart on the third. We always face Jesus towards the congregation. The tradition of the candles associated with the table of the Lord is like this. As I mentioned, when the early Christians went into the catacombs to say Mass with the altar stones, and they carried candles to light the way. They obviously could not see there. So these candles became symbols of the light of Christ. Also, they are here, their illumination is here to help lift our prayers up to the Lord. So this is the purpose of our candles. The other thing that's always on the altar during services is what we call a corporal. And I'll hold this one up. This is a small corporal. We use a larger one on weekends, but this is a small one. And it lays on the altar cloth right here in front of the celebrant. Corporal means body. And so the intent here is that the items to be consecrated, being the bread and wine, are placed near or on the corporal for the consecration. Now the celebrant calls upon the power of the Holy Spirit to change the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Like when Christ suffered and died for us, and he became our sacrifice, so in turn we're celebrating that here. Christ was wrapped in a linen shroud, and so we have a linen corporal here on the altar to surround our bread and wine. The other thing you'll notice on this altar is we have a crucifix. Very plain, very small crucifix. This tradition comes down from the 1500s, and the crucifix was intended to be a representation and or a reminder of the suffering and death of Jesus for us, which we also have back here on our main cross. But it is placed here on the altar, and in the 1500s, the church, through tradition, had decided that a crucifix on the altar was most appropriate. So it reminds the clergy and the congregation of Jesus' sacrifice on the altar. Now, our altar is very large, and quite often we hear people say, "Are you sitting on the altar?" Well, nobody sits on the altar, but they may sit in the sanctuary. The altar sits in the center of the sanctuary, so it is the focal point in the church. The sanctuary is all of the area around the altar that is raised higher than the church nave. And within the sanctuary, and by the way, sanctuary means holy place. So within the sanctuary, we have the ambo where the readings occur. We have the tabernacle. We have the altar, and we have the cantor stand, and we have the chairs where the ministers and clergy sit, all in the sanctuary. All of these are made out of seashell marble. So our sanctuary is quite large, and it encompasses all of this. So when the next time you come to Mass, when we finally do have a Mass here, maybe you will have a better appreciation of the table of the Lord, because it is quite the focal point of everything and most appropriate to talk about right after Easter. So, isn't it just great to learn something new about our church that we've maybe never known before? I hope all of you are doing well, and I really appreciate you listening in and looking in on us. May the Lord keep you safe, you and your family both. Thank you very much.